Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Noha Hifni, the co-founder of She's Arab. And with me here is Samar Al-Shurafa, my business partner and the co-founder of She's Arab. And we'll be your co-host for today's session. So thank you to all our members who continue to be here supporting our mission, and to all of you who have also newly joined us. We are so pleased with the turnout for today's session. We're all obviously going through a very challenging time and trying to adjust to a new normal. And as women, you know, we've been at the forefront of this crisis in many ways, as mothers, as teachers, nurses, and even just trying to balance work and life. And so we're so pleased as She's Arab to be able to roll out and take our network online. Today is going to be the first in a series of webinar talks that we'll be speaking and pulling together for you. And these are talks that will be exclusively offered for our network. And the topic of today's panel discussion is understanding the global impact of the coronavirus, COVID-19, and how to make the best out of it. And on this note, we are honored to be joined today by an exceptional lineup of global experts. All of them have a wealth of experience, and as She's Arab, we're very, very honored that they have given us this time to talk with all of you and with us. So our moderator for today is Michael Bociurkiw, Global Affairs Analyst, speaker, writer, contributor to CNN Opinion, and the host of the Global Impact podcast, which actually focuses on COVID-19. So if any of you are interested to get updates, please tune into that. We also have Dr. Sue Varma, renowned board-certified psychiatrist, clinical assistant professor at New York University, Langone, and New York City. Dr. Sue also is a commentator on various TV shows in her area of expertise. And last but definitely not least, Lena Duke, MBA, social media strategist and global speaker, the founder of Untold Women. These speakers are truly inspirational, and please do follow them on their social media channels online. There is a lot of wealthy information and useful information out there. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. First of all, we'd be really grateful if everyone can mute their microphones in order to minimize the noise distraction. Secondly, we'll be allocating 15 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A. However, please feel free to submit your questions throughout the session by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you do have friends and colleagues or anyone who was interested to attend but was unable to make it, we also want to inform you that this is going to be a recorded session. So we plan to share it further on all of our social media channels. So please do follow us at She's Arab if you are not already. And last but not least, if you do get disconnected, please use the same link to rejoin the session. That's it from our side, and over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much for the nice welcome, and my biggest compliments to Samara, Noha, and She's Arab team for organizing this. It's a very, very historic time right now, all over the world, a very troublesome time, but I think we all agree that these are exactly the types of forums that will help us get through this with a knowledgeable and fact-based approach. And I'm very happy to be joined by this expert panel as well, by Sue and Lena. So one of the things I'd like to do is give you some situational awareness and then some context of where we are right now. And by the way, right now I'm on the Pacific Ocean in beautiful British Columbia in Canada. We're one of the hotspots in Canada, but nowhere near some of the other hotspots on the other side of the border. So my association with this crisis is the following. I do have a background in public health and humanitarian work. I'm a former spokesperson for UNICEF. I've worked many, many years in the Middle East North Africa, also with polio eradication in places like Pakistan and Nigeria. And then now as a global affairs analyst and contributor to CNN Opinion, I was one of the first to report on the virus. I actually took on my former employer, the United Nations, for really what I thought they were dragging their feet on declaring a global public health emergency. I also reported on the tragic death of the Chinese whistleblower doctor, you may recall, in early February, Li Wenliang. But no matter what your background is, what kind of knowledge you have as a humanitarian worker, as a journalist, nothing, absolutely nothing could prepare us for the current scenario we have right now. It is hard to find the words sometimes, but it's hard to imagine that this is in a way far, far bigger than 9/11, than the South Asian tsunami, and now comparisons are being made to this as you know, on the scale of the world wars. So right now, again, there was some, I won't dwell on numbers, but there was some pretty, frankly, grim reading this morning in terms of where we are. We're at 750,000 deaths. And then most of them, well, we have 10,000 in Italy, and the US is on track to becoming the nation with the most number of cases. The US has now, hard to believe, more confirmed cases than any other country. They have more than 186,000 according to CNN this morning, and more than 3,800 have died in the US. Sorry, let me fix that figure. 36,000 total globally, 405 deaths. And then maybe some of you saw the White House briefing yesterday, but it seems that the White House has finally come around to recognizing the scope of the problem, especially in the United States. And the figures were absolutely eye-popping, that between 100,000 and 240,000 Americans could die in the coming weeks. And that is with the current measures that are taking place. If there was no mitigation whatsoever, those figures would be far, far higher. And right now, like most of us in Canada, at least 80% of Americans are under stay-at-home orders. I'm very worried about a few hotspots. We're pretty familiar with the situation in Italy right now, but in Spain, they've recorded a daily death toll of close to 1,000 over the past 24 hours, meaning altogether 9,000 people have died in the country as a result of coronavirus. So they're catching up with Italy. Also, Iran is still dealing with the huge numbers there. And there are now more than 800,000 confirmed cases around the world. So we're getting close to 1 million. And in the United Kingdom, which is seen to have come late to mitigation or containment measures, like in the United States, there's a growing concern there for the lack of tests for coronavirus, and it's kind of becoming a political problem there. Enough about figures. I wanted to give you a kind of context of what I'm seeing that is happening around the world. And what we're seeing is different approaches in different countries and different jurisdictions and different municipalities. Normally in a global pandemic or global public health emergency, the World Health Organization, which of course is a UN agency, would be the lead agency, coordinating agency, and everyone would follow their advice. And indeed, once they did get a grasp on the scope of the problem, they did give very, very strong and clear and unambiguous recommendations. And one of the first was they discouraged travel and trade restrictions. Well, that didn't last very long. It was one of the first things, actually, that a lot of countries did. So we're seeing a real, what I call, patchwork quilt of public health responses. And on the one hand, one side of the spectrum, the more draconian side of the spectrum, you have the Chinas of the world, Hong Kong and Singapore, where you've had strict contact tracing, I would almost say hyper contact tracing, quarantines, using electronic surveillance even, travel bans. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have someone like Brazil, where there are almost zero restrictions, and the president there is almost mocking this virus. So that's where we are. But I have to tell you that I mentioned Singapore, and they were one of the first to move very aggressively. They were one of the first to move very, well, they moved very early, and they did put in very, very strict measures. Of course, it is a smaller city-state, it's easy to contain things, but their case level was like Hong Kong's like about 10 days ago. They were under 200 cases, and now I believe they're heading up to 1,000. So many-fold increase. And it is scary, because when you have a place that's small with such good tracing and other measures put in, and yet their numbers continue to go up, well, it's a worrisome cause. And it's possible that, well, actually, it's a fact that some of the new cases have come from very densely populated areas, dormitories where foreign workers live, that sort of thing. So they're dealing with it as best they can, but it's some place to keep an eye on. And then, you know, I'm also thinking that it's a bit ironic, but one of the first places to kind of overcome this virus and to get their economy roaring again is where the virus came from, China. Of course, they're going to have a long curve, a steep curve, to get their economy back to the way it was, because they're basically the world's manufacturing hub. Demand is way down, so well, it remains to be seen how long their recovery will take place. And I'm also thinking countries which also moved very earlier, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, those will come back online economically much sooner than the rest of the world. But there are questions, for example, in places like Japan, they've managed to dodge a massive spike despite what many regard fairly subdued measures. And there are questions whether they've reassigned or recategorized coronavirus cases as simply pneumonia. This was in a conversation with a Japanese journalist just 2 days ago. And we're also seeing some questionable reporting in places like Russia, which until now has pretty much tried to deny there's a problem, but Moscow is now under lockdown, and they were being accused of also doing the same thing, of categorizing coronavirus illnesses or deaths as simply pneumonia, but I think they're now snapping back into reality. Now, there is parts of, further good news elsewhere too. It does look like something we've been praying for, that you know, the curve in Italy is starting to level off. They've been under a very, very strict lockdown, as you all know. The government has taken very good measures. They have one of the best health systems, I would say, in Europe, but simply overwhelmed by the wave, the tsunami of cases. And then also, you know, it's often been said in WHO briefings and elsewhere that viruses do not discriminate. They can hit anybody. And I now have, for example, 2 friends who have been struck by the virus, one here from Canada. And then also you guys, dear audience, you might have seen in the news that Chris Cuomo, the CNN anchor and the brother of the governor of New York, has been struck with coronavirus. We've also had government leaders, Boris Johnson, for instance. You've had ministers of health in various countries. The First Lady of Canada was struck with coronavirus, but has now come out of the illness. So it does raise concern too about the ability of governance in certain countries. If too many ministers, cabinet ministers, government officials get sickened, there could be a problem in terms of getting decision-making done. Already parts of the first responders and the hotspot of New York City have been very, very badly hit. Police force, firemen, first responders. So that's something to keep an eye on. And it behooves, I think, governments to really put in quickly mitigation measures like some companies have done, where they've spread out their management to different locations. You don't keep them all together in one place. And also, social distancing is happening in many places around the world. If it isn't, it should be happening. The concern here is, this was raised by the former Minister of Health of Ukraine yesterday in an Atlantic Council webinar, that already on the streets of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, and elsewhere, people are looking at each other with suspicion. I even see it here in British Columbia. When you go for a walk, people kind of do a dance to get around you. But the fear is that even once the virus is under control, whether these types of attitudes will be sticking, that we're going to need some kind of road out of here where people aren't suspicious or fearful of each other anymore. And I raise this because where I live, for example, we have a very elderly population, and many of them are absolutely terrified, and with good reason, of catching the virus. So I think that demographic will be one of the last to come out of this kind of fearful environment, if you will. I'm going to kind of wrap up, but I'm working on a CNN op-ed piece right now. It'll probably be up in the next 24 hours or so, about how authoritarian leaders or strongmen seem to be manipulating the emergency to impose draconian measures, such as suspending elections, or banning mass gatherings, or putting in laws that restrict the flow of information, even reducing the speed of the internet, that sort of thing. So they've been called out on this by organizations like the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, and by other rights organizations. It's been very interesting to see how in some countries people have registered their discontent. For example, in Brazil, I mentioned the president there earlier, they come out every day and bang pots and pans as a sign of their discontentment. So it goes to show you the kind of innovation and strength of people. And then Lena will maybe mention this, but also we're seeing absolutely through the roof use of social media, not only in terms of making ourselves feel more as a connected global community, but also sharing information, but also calling out government officials or others if we don't see they're doing the right thing. So social media is playing an almost unprecedented role right now in this crisis. All right, with that, I think I'm up to my time limit for my little introduction. I'll be back to answer some questions. And Dr. Su, we're very excited to have you. For many of us, you're not only a friend now, but you're also, before we met you, a familiar face on network television in the United States. I've often wondered where you find the time in a 24-hour period to do everything that you do, but we're very pleased to have you. And you already introduced at the top of the webcast, so I will hand the floor over to you. Thank you for joining us. Oh, we may have to unmute. There we go. Yeah.
Hi, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to Shizar for having me. I really appreciate the invitation and to speak with you all. You know, as was said, I'm based in New York City, so this is very interesting and challenging times for all of us, not only as a citizen, but also as a healthcare worker. And, you know, what I can say is somebody in my early career was working as the medical director of the 9/11 mental health program. And then since then have been someone who has worked in trauma after a variety of disasters, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the tsunami. And as Michael pointed out, that this is absolutely going to be, and already has been, different than any mass disaster for a variety of reasons. One of the things that we see that affects our psychological health afterwards is trauma on multiple levels. And we're also already seeing problems in employment, financial losses, loss of loved ones, loss of our own health, and then the anxiety that comes along with each of these. So with every hit, we are then exponentially increasing our exposure to getting anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. We also see things like substance abuse, domestic violence, child abuse increasing. One recent Pew Center research that was done last week showed that 18% of individuals were feeling anxiety related to coronavirus, as opposed to 9% in the year before. We're also seeing that in previous quarantines, psychological health is impacted. In one study in 2007 equine flu, we saw that 34% of the population was experiencing anxiety and depression after being quarantined for just 10 days. What are some of the risk factors that are going to impact whether or not we get something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is going to be on how long this quarantine is. Obviously, the longer the quarantines, even though they're extremely necessary, it is going to further erode our mental health. So, but there are things that we can do. First of all, monitoring it, knowing what the signs and symptoms are, knowing who the vulnerable populations are, all of this is going to be really key. We know that women are particularly at increased risk in the coronavirus and any mass disaster for a variety of reasons. They play a lot of roles. They wear many hats as healthcare workers, as educators, as frontline people in a variety of ways and organizations. They're also the caregivers in their own home to elderly parents, to young children. And they're also the ones impacted financially the most. So we need to protect these more vulnerable populations by encouraging them to seek help, to seek support, and to minimize the stigma around getting mental health treatment in general. So one of the most important things is being able to detect what the symptoms are. And I think it's really important to point out that in every culture, symptoms of mental health issues might present differently. In a lot of cultures, it is typical for people to have physical symptoms, even in the United States. A lot of times people will present to emergency rooms and saying that they feel as if they're having a heart attack. I can't tell you how many patients have come to me as a result of being told by their primary care doctor or the emergency room physician that you've been cleared medically. Your symptoms that presented as a heart attack are actually psychological distress, and it would be beneficial for you to seek therapy and perhaps medication or discuss that with a psychiatrist. In my practice, I'm a board certified psychiatrist, so I have the medical training, but I'm a big proponent of therapy, and specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, which is evidence-based, scientific, and works very effectively in a vast majority of people. In 2/3 of people with anxiety and depression, in 8 to 10 sessions, people can get better. We also know that if you have a prior history of anxiety, depression, trauma, you're more likely to have another episode following a stressful event. People who have a history of depression, if you've had one episode of depression, and I'll go into what I mean by depression, but major depressive disorder, you're at a 50% risk of having a second episode. If you've had 2 episodes of depression, you are at a 75% risk. And if you've had 3, you're at a 90% risk of getting another episode of major depressive disorder. So how do we define major depressive disorder, and how is it different than just having a low mood? Look, all of us are going to be experiencing stress. And one of the reasons that we're experiencing stress in the coronavirus, for a lot of women particularly, and this Pew Research study found that people who are most vulnerable were women, low income, and people with child care responsibilities, specifically children under the age of 12. So again, you're wearing many hats. You're zipping out in and out of many roles. Especially they talked about women that had to work from home, and if they were having difficulty navigating the work from home situation, which a lot of us are. So going back to major depressive disorder and how it differentiates from just low mood. Low mood is not thought to impact your daily functioning. So a person can have a low mood and still get up and do what they need to do. They're able to talk about it, and they're able to effectively reduce their stress throughout the day in a variety of ways. And I'll get into effective and healthy coping mechanisms. But the definition, or the way that we would diagnose major depressive disorder, is a person who has a low mood for 2 or more weeks, along with associated symptoms. And those associated symptoms are a person who's sleeping too much or too little, a person who is eating more than usual or eating much less than usual. We can see weight changes as a result of the appetite changes, feeling guilty, low energy, feelings of worthlessness, and at times feeling that life might not be worth living, and what we call suicidal thoughts. And it's really important to monitor that. If you're a loved one, don't be afraid to ask. If you are a healthcare worker, don't be afraid to ask. A lot of times people are afraid of asking the tough questions. Do you feel like life is not worth living? Would you want to end your life? Have you ever thought about it? How would you go about doing it? Has that ever happened to you? We're afraid to ask those tough questions because we're afraid of planting seeds in people's minds. But I can reassure you that if somebody does carry something out, they've probably had those thoughts for a long time. And if anything, you're normalizing it for them and you're giving them a safe space. The opportunity to create safe spaces there are many, and I would invite people to do that. If you feel strong enough to be able to give space, to be able to bear witness for what somebody else is going through, and to encourage them to seek psychological help, that is the best thing that you can do for a loved one who might be experiencing distress. That might start with even a primary care telehealth visit to say, Doc, I want to be able to schedule a visit with you just to talk about my mental health. Now, I recognize what I'm saying might be a luxury for a lot of people. They say, I don't talk about my mental health. It's not something we really acknowledge in our culture. And I can say even in the United States, this is not something that we really have been pushing until recently. I have been working as a medical contributor for the last 13 years in parallel with my career as a psychiatrist and as an educator teaching at the medical universities. And I can tell you that mental health is something that's always been in the back, corner, hush hush. And only in recent years have we been able to talk so freely where people can say, I'm seeing a therapist. They can tell their boss, I need time off. I have a weekly standing appointment. And even then, often people are met with criticism and stigma and ignorance. So we need to be able to mainstream these mental health conversations. I always joke and say, hey, if you can give your friend a recommendation for the best restaurant you've ever been to or the best movie you've ever seen, why not give them a recommendation for the best therapist or the best self-help book that you have ever read? So try to normalize and share your own experiences. I'm finding that a lot more people who are in a position of power, who are celebrated, who are celebrities, are starting to come out. And that's changing things for us because it's giving people the safe space that allows them to be able to talk about these conversations. So in addition to depression, I talked about major depressive disorder. That is something to look out for. Symptoms of anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder include being anxious and having trouble sleeping, restlessness, fatigue throughout the day, difficulty concentrating, and irritability. So sleep is a big component. Sleep itself in psychiatry can be a disorder in and of itself, but often sleep is considered a window into a person's mental health. So it's really important to ask somebody, how are you sleeping? Somebody may tell you, I don't feel anxious, I don't feel depressed. And why? Because they're active, they're busy, their mind is engaged during the day. But at night, I'm finding that almost across the board, anybody I'm talking to, they will tell me that they're having either difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, waking up early morning, and their mind is already racing about all of it that they need to do today, or I can't believe I'm in this nightmare. The first thing we do, what do we do? We're attached to our phones. Our phones are the first people we greet, or the first item or object you greet in the morning. There was a study that says that spouses are more likely to greet their phone than they are each other in the morning, and it's the last thing that we say good night to, quote unquote, before we go to bed. So we're waking up to a state of panic and alert every morning as the death tolls rise, and we're swiping through all of the headlines of the economy today. The first thing I saw is, what's happening with the economy and the Dow Jones, and it's dropping. This is not helpful and healthy, I think, not sustainable for the long term to be able to be plugged into the 24-hour news cycle. So when I'm talking about some of the problems that I mentioned, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, I'll talk about that in a second, but I also want to spend a couple minutes on the treatment of all of this. And of course, there's not going to be any substitute for getting actual mental health treatment, but some of the things that you can do at home can be preventative or an adjunct or a supplement to a person that's going through the psychological distress. So I talked about depression, I talked about anxiety. Quickly, post-traumatic stress disorder is basically after 1 month of experiencing these symptoms, it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. Prior to that, it is called acute stress disorder, and some of the symptoms are very similar, but it's basically when a person is exposed to life-threatening events, and in this case, the coronavirus feels like it is a life-threatening event, and depending on your level of exposure or who was exposed, and did you lose family members, did you lose a job, were there financial losses, or you might even experience anxiety about getting it. The more likely you think you are to get it, obviously the higher your stress level. Are you having difficulty sleeping? These are all symptoms of acute stress disorder, later becoming post-traumatic stress disorder. Difficulty sleeping, irritability, avoidance, numbness, detachment, depression, irritability, sleep problems, hypervigilance, being more drawn to the news, or maybe even being more avoidant of the news. So it can go in both ways. So all of these are things to look out for. We know that in one hospital in Texas, a report came out during 1 week in March that the child abuse cases had increased and the number of deaths had increased in that 1 week because parents were already perhaps at risk for their own mental health issues, maybe more at risk for domestic violence, substance abuse, all of the things that predispose the home to child abuse. Now add in more time that people are spending together in close quarters. Intimate partner violence is also on the rise. So these are things that we need to be careful of and get people help very early on. So some of the things that I want to talk about quickly in terms of how do we alleviate some of the direct distress. One thing is maintaining routine as much as possible. Our nights and our days are going to be completely flipped. We were talking about Ramadan in our conversation with She is Arab, and we were talking about how that's coming up and how that's an opportunity for mass gatherings and for celebration and for time for observing important rituals, but that opportunity may not be there, and also the fact that people are fasting during the day, and then are they now going to be working during the night? So it'll be interesting to see what's the social, cultural, religious context of what we're going through, and how our norms that are so important to us, that ground us as people, that connect us as people, are changing. But we have to come up with creative ways to stay connected, and that's another big part of this. I talk about the 4 M's of mental health, and I think that I talk about this at baseline, but it is so much more important during this age and time of coronavirus to maintain it. The 4 M's of mental health are mindfulness, movement, mastery, and meaningful engagement. So what I mean by this is mindfulness is, regardless of what your sort of religious, spiritual beliefs, there is a big movement of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which has to do with some Eastern wisdom taken with Western science, whatever you want to call it, this mix of philosophy, that mindfulness, 10 minutes of meditation, prayer, whatever it is that you feel comfortable with, you can incorporate it into your daily life. It's basically you being aware of your breath, shutting your eyes, eyes closed, and breathing, and giving yourself space and time outside of your day. So 10 minutes of mindfulness, 15 minutes if you can do more, wonderful. Movement. Are you allowed to take a brisk walk outside, depending on what the advisories are in your local community with social distancing? If not, are there exercises that you can do at home? Quick things that a lot of people like. There's so many videos, yoga, but there's so many videos for strength training. Do you have any weights at home? Can you do anything? Squats, lunges, planks, push-ups, abdominal, anything you can do, getting a resistance band. And of course, depending on your flexibility, your strength to begin with, don't injure yourself, get clearance from your doctor, basic things. And again, this is not medical advice, I'm just speaking in general. So we talked about mindfulness and movement. Now mastery, this is really important for me, and anything that you can do that's creative, that allows you to get out of your head, that gets you in a state of flow. For a lot of us, if we are called to do something, this is the opportunity to do it, whether it be writing a blog, whether it be giving a talk, whether it be preparing for talk, whatever it might be that helps you connect in your profession, and gives you a sense of meaning and purpose beyond this coronavirus, and honestly beyond even your role as a caretaker. I think that so many women have a lot of pride, and I do too as a parent, but I think it's really important for us to keep engaged and have a sense of meaning and purpose that goes beyond this time of stress that we're dealing with right now. So one of the Olympic athletes in the United States said that even though the Olympic Games are canceled, our dreams are not canceled. So keep your dreams, please, and continue to plan for what life will be afterwards, after the coronavirus, because most of us will get through this alive and healthy, I hope. And then the last part is meaningful engagement, which is what we're doing right now, is being connected to one another, doing the FaceTime, the Skype, the Zooms, whatever you can to stay connected. make time, express how you feel, let people know how you feel about them. This is an opportunity for you to thank people, to check in with people, to express gratitude. One of the things I like to do on a daily basis, which is both a stress reliever and also a way of expressing gratitude, is writing and keeping a journal, if you can do that. So these are just some tips. I'm obviously shrinking, years of sort of professional experience into, trying to distill it into 15 minutes of what the most useful tips are. But, getting an early diagnosis, getting treatment, getting help, getting support. When we talk about resilience, the key features in resilience are cognitive flexibility. So being able to look at things from a different angle, reframing your mindset, social support, altruism. We know that if we're able to switch to a mindset of altruism, so looking at the quarantine, one of the studies in Lancet recently that was a review about effects of social quarantine said that if people are able to look at the social distancing more from an altruism point of view, that I'm helping somebody else, I'm not infecting somebody else, I'm keeping the community safe, rather than looking at it as a compulsion, that's something that's being done to me, a right that's being stripped away from me. If we're able to change our mindset, is very helpful. And the sense of humor is huge. So I know that there might be a lot of irreverent memes and jokes going on, but whatever keeps you light, if you need to turn to Netflix, whatever healthy forms of escapism, I tell people to avoid excessive eating, emotional eating, excessive alcohol. So keeping it light and having distractions, minimizing the news intrusions as much as possible. Once a day, I think, is okay. Once or twice a day. Staying connected locally is more important than necessarily knowing the death toll globally, every hour. So that's my bit. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm open to questions later on. And sorry if I took too long.
Thank you, Dr. Sue. That was absolutely wonderful. We really, really appreciate you. Speaking of questions, please a reminder to send in your questions, and we will deal with them as soon as our next panelist finishes her presentation. A couple of quick points following up on Dr. Sue. Previous to coming here at home, I've already been under self-isolation for 2 weeks. So I was in the hotspots of New York City and London, and one of the things I noticed there, I said on air on CNN, was that you really do notice traveling around after these kind of lockdowns have been imposed, that the people taking the subways and in those very dense situations are low-income people. And my fear, as I voiced at the time, was that they are going to be the ones who are disproportionately hit by this virus, not only, God forbid, medically, but also economically. They don't have the option of walking to work because it's too far. They don't have the money to take an Uber or a taxi, so they have to take public transit. And then just quickly, the other thing, I'm so glad Dr. Sue mentioned at home kind of measures you can take to strengthen and preserve your mental health, because on the other hand, anyone who has underlying health conditions or had elective surgery or anything like that scheduled, even here in Canada, it's a problem. And my fear is the preventative things that we usually do, that we go to the doctor for, are going to be kind of a collateral damage from all of this, that it's going to pile up and then have to be dealt with later once the crisis is over. So thank you again. And now we turn to Lena, who I'll remind you is well, she calls herself a social media strategist. I call her a social media guru. She's Arab, by the way, and has spent a lot of time in the Middle East. And I'm honored to also not only call her a friend, but a peer mentor. We really support each other, not only now, but usually in terms of the work that we do. So Lena, thank you for joining us. I give the floor to you.
Thanks for having me. And I wanted to say thank you to Samara Shurafa and Noha Hafni for really starting this amazing platform. She is Arab. I mean, as an Arab female speaker, excuse me, I'm really proud of this platform that puts Arab female speakers front and center. So kudos to you, ladies. So I'm talking about social media. Physical distancing these days is making us crave social connection more than ever. And in my space, social media, which is really everybody's space because everybody is online today more than ever, I'm seeing a surge in social media activity. So every time I log on, and I'm sure you have noticed that as well, I see people having live Instagram sessions, LinkedIn sessions, you name it. People are engaged. They are online, they want to see what's happening, and they want to connect with other people. So Now is really the time to connect and engage and reach out to community. But the challenge is how to do it. Is it okay to go and post an Instagram post with throwback photos to your last vacation? The answer is no. Bear in mind, excuse me, that excuse me, there's a lot of people really impacted by COVID-19 right now. So bear that in mind. It's really important to strike the right balance. Excuse me. I've seen a lot of tone-deaf posts from emails from consultants asking me, you know, this is how, you know, subscribe to my newsletter so you can grow your business. So these tone-deaf posts or emails really are badly received by your audience. So what to do, how to post on social media. I'm gonna share with you about 6 tips, yes, 6 tips right now to help you make the most out of your social media right now. So tip number 1, give your social media a quick facelift. Someone told me the other day, we always complain about the lack of time. Well, guess what? We've been given the gift of time. I mean, yeah, there's a lot to do during the day, especially if you're homeschooling, if you're a parent and you have kids at home, but then there's nothing else to do. You're really at home all day. And now is the time to update your LinkedIn profile, update your LinkedIn summary. Now is the time to add your new accomplishments or add new graphics to your Twitter, or work on that website you've been meaning to work on for a long time. Take advantage of the time disposable to you and do it right now. Tip number 2, show that you care through your posts. So what kind of content to post about? Messages of compassion, empathy, and kindness are really being well received, and this is really what the world needs right now. So I'm seeing a lot of that, but then not overly joyful. It really has to be genuine. You want to share your community that you care. So try to be authentic about it. Don't pretend to be hopeful if you're not. You can share quotes by other people about that, so that's also helpful as well. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3, if you have not done that yet, write a relevant blog post telling people in your space how COVID-19 is impacting your industry. If you're, I mean, this might not apply for everybody, but if you're a consultant, if you're an expert, absolutely do that. Because people, this is top of mind with everybody. They want to know how this is impacting their industry. If you can provide some knowledge, some tips, by all means, do that right now, as soon as you can. Tip number 4, reach out to your community. So I've had a little experiment in the past couple of weeks. I posted on LinkedIn an invitation for my network to invite me to have virtual coffee. And I said, let's connect, let's discuss ideas, let's talk social media. By all means, reach out to me. And I created a very fun graphic and had I set up on Calendly schedules for people to go out and book me. And I had 10 coffees in 2 weeks. And it was such an amazing experience. I actually invited some of the people that I had coffee with on this webinar today. So try it out. You never know. I know someone else in my network who tried and got some really good feedback. Tip number 5: be consistent. So if you're going to have let's say an Instagram live session today and then stop, it doesn't work that way. You kind of need a plan. So I've been seeing a lot of Instagram and LinkedIn live sessions. So Whitney Johnson, for example, top management thinker, goes on LinkedIn every single day at 9 a.m. for half an hour and engages her audience in topics on disruption, management through chaos, topics that she really writes on and is an expert on. But the key is consistency every single day at 9 a.m. Mel Robbins, who is one of the top female speakers. In fact, I believe the most highly paid female TEDx speaker in the world, goes on Instagram live every single day, I believe around 11 a.m. Amy Cuddy, who was famous for the Wonder Woman pose and argued that when you do that, it helps you with your self-confidence, goes on Instagram every day at 11 a.m. to discuss writing tips, and she features a guest every time. So consistency is key. Have a rough plan, a content calendar would help, a schedule of what kind of content you're going to engage your audience in. Tip number 6, push yourself outside your comfort zone. A lot of us make up excuses for not putting ourselves out there. I mean, sometimes I'm guilty of doing that, and I try my best to practice what I preach. So if you have put off, or if you've been making excuses for not going live on Instagram or on LinkedIn, but I would say Instagram is probably easier to do because it's your network of friends and colleagues, and it's a mix of people. Do it. Now is the time to do it. Push yourself outside your comfort zone. Challenge yourself to do at least one and see how it works. The first one is always the hardest, and then it becomes easier every time. And now that you can have an expert, so you can have some kind of a plan. If you're a consultant, someone in sales and marketing, this is a really great exposure for you. So definitely do that. If you can walk away with one tip right now, is do not wait for things to be perfect. Do not wait until your website is absolutely perfect and amazing, or your LinkedIn is ready before you engage. Do it right away. I want to wrap up by going over the tips again. Give your social media a facelift. Update your LinkedIn. If you're on your Twitter, your Instagram, make sure it's up to date. Show that you care with your community. Post messages of compassion, empathy, and kindness, but definitely be genuine about it. Tip number 3, write a relevant blog post, especially on LinkedIn. Very user-friendly. Do it, 500 words. Don't spend too much time on it. Maybe assign 25 minutes and get it out there. Tip number 4, reach out to your community, set up virtual coffees, reach out to colleagues and friends and see how they're doing. They would appreciate that. Tip number 5, be consistent in your efforts. So have a schedule, a plan, use a content calendar, that would help. And tip number 6, push yourself outside your comfort zone. And that concludes my tips.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lena. That was wonderful. One of the things I loved about when I saw the composition of this panel was I thought there would be fantastic overlap between Dr. Sue and Lena in terms of the guidance they were giving. And one of the things I think both of you have said in the not the short time I've known you, but is that you don't have to be perfect all the time. It's really important under these kind of stressful conditions. And Lena, I really like what you said as well, that this is a really positive way to look at what we're in right now, as we've been given the gift of time. So use it properly and emphasize the kindness and empathy and compassion. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A. And Samar, I know we agreed to another model, but I have already had a pop-up question here. So I'll just go ahead and read that one and direct it to one of the panelists. And then if you have others, I'll give the floor to you. But this is from Tamara in Cape Town, South Africa. Hi, Tamara, and thank you for sending your question in. She says self-isolation has strong class and racial dimensions in South Africa, where inequality is high. What we privileged self-isolators can do is not possible for a Black South African living in one room with his or her family. What are some of the measures people in poor and disadvantaged communities can do to address mental health issues, which are already prevalent in those areas due to issues such as higher levels of poverty, high levels of gender-based violence, lack of access to mental health services, etc.? Thank you. Dr. Sue, would you like to take that one?
Sure, yeah, so look, I think the first thing to me is that having a language around mental health is going to be so important. I think that, as I mentioned, that in every culture, the manifestations of mental health issues will present differently. And in a lot of cultures, it's more acceptable to be able to share the physiological aspects of anxiety and depression. And so often people will say, just the way young kids will say that I have a stomach ache when they don't want to go to school because they're feeling anxious, or that a lot of times people will say I have a headache, or my chest is, I'm having chest palpitations or heart racing. So I would say that when a person presents with medical symptoms, to also for physicians, for caregivers, for healthcare workers, for everybody to be able to develop a language to say, well, tell me also about the stress levels. Your point is well taken, and there have been a lot of articles about what's happening in India and how the social distancing is also something that really middle and upper classes can enjoy. And there were pictures of people living in slums, and they literally had one toilet per 1,400 people in some of the shanty towns. And running water obviously is a privilege, and not being able to have access to sanitation. So when we're talking about washing your hands and hand sanitizer, I mean, these are just things that people don't have access to. So from a mental health point of view, it's going to take developing a language and emotional awareness and insight, which is hard to do in times of crisis. And I always tell people, try to develop these skills as much as possible during peacetime. So when you're in a war, you have access to these things, and people being able to give each other space. I think one of the ways to decrease psychological distress is by getting support in the family. And for women, often that will be in the form of childcare, and their spouses being able to, or their partners being able to have reduced stress, because stress and anger and irritability and tension in the home often puts women at risk for partner violence. So really, we're talking about we're talking about so many different dimensions at one time: socio-cultural, political, economic, and mental health. And it's going to be very challenging. How do you create language? How do you create services in a place where maybe they didn't exist? And, mental health is always seen as a luxury. And we don't realize that our ability to work or be productive is completely tied and rests upon, obviously, your physical health, but also your mental health. And we know that in the United States, for example, depression costs the country $200 billion with a B dollars annually because of work-related stress, that people can't either show up to work, or they're showing up and they're not able to be productive. It's this idea not just of absenteeism, but presenteeism. You're showing up to work, but you can't work. So again, so many layers have to be dealt with, but giving language and giving people space is going to be really key to be able to express their emotion and be able to use the primary care system, because that really is the front line for people to say, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling anxious. So they have to even be aware, because the doctors will not ask you specifically questions about stress if you don't even have access to basic water, sanitation, vaccinations. Those are the priorities. Mental health, unfortunately, gets the last place. So you being educated and being a proponent for yourself and being for your one for your family is going to be the first stepping stone in all of this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doctor. Here's one for Lena from Salma. Lena, what resources can you recommend for updating social media engagement?
My go-to platform for updating my social media is canva.com, canva.com, because you can create your own graphics, but with the right dimensions for the right platform. So you can create, for example, a post for Instagram with the right dimensions. So I would go to that canva.com. Now, to schedule posts, you can use buffer.com as well. Having said that, I'm not a big fan of scheduling. You can schedule as long as you can check that schedule every day, because we don't know what's happening. Things are changing so fast. So if you have something scheduled for Friday, who knows, by Friday, something big might hit us. So, so always bear in mind that when you schedule, using any scheduling tools, there's buffer.com, there's hootsuite.com as well. But I mainly use Buffer because I like the interface. It's user-friendly.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Very helpful. I think we have time for one more. This is from Mentala. For me, what measures are there for low-income communities and unemployed people to do in this time in terms of having a basic income, food, and security? That's a very good question, and one that we've been grappling with here in relatively wealthy societies. For example, in Canada, there have been, I would say, unprecedented sorry, before I get onto that, I just have to mention that we are nearing the 1 hour mark, but we will attempt to go over for a few minutes and hopefully the system won't cut us off. But anyway, yeah, actually unprecedented measures have been taken, for example, here in Canada to assist the homeless, for example, building more permanent shelter for them, ensuring their access to food, that sort of thing. But as I said before, what I've noticed in, for example, in New York and even in London, that those at the bottom of the economic ladder, those people who live from gig to gig or paycheck to paycheck, are going to be impacted the most. But having said that, I've been seeing in some of the policies rolled out by various governments is that they do recognize now that the economies have changed, that there are more people working on contract or as freelancers or in the gig economy. So the measures do include them. But I've seen a lot of reports on people, for example, who drive taxis or Ubers, give out groceries. They're absolutely terrified of contracting the virus because oftentimes they're single wage owners in a household. They're caring for a lot of people. They just don't have the luxury of taking time off. So this is something that governments need to be reminded of as often as we can possibly remind them. So on that, I will say thank you again to the organizers, to Samar and Noha and their colleagues. This was a very, very helpful discussion, I think, in terms of looking not only at what the actual situation is, but how we can deal with it in our own ways. And I salute Dr. Su for raising those red flags. When you were talking, Dr. Su, I thought, now I better monitor my sleep as well, because a lot of us, and for example, the type of work that we do, we're so full of adrenaline during the day. But yeah, at night, I guess our brain is resting, but now dealing with the other aspects. So very, very important in that kind of mind-body connectiveness. And then Lena, thank you again also for your very, very helpful 6 tips. Again, to echo what Lena said, is we've been given the gift of time. Use it effectively. We appreciate that many of you are under incredible stress. You're maybe in confined spaces. You have the whole family with you. You're dealing not only with your career or career development, but also homeschooling, that sort of thing. So remember, we're in this together. I know this has almost become a cliche to say during this time, but we're in this together, meaning, and we will get through this. There is a bright light at the other end of the tunnel. And for that to happen, however, we not only have to adhere to the advice that the professionals, the experts are telling us, but we also have to remember, I think as both of you said, Lena and Dr. Su, is to reach out to others and check in on each other. How are we doing? Even if you've not been in contact with someone perhaps for years and they pop into your mind, well, maybe there's a reason they popped into your mind. So social media is also a gift and gives us that ability. Mm-hmm. So
definitely. On that note, I'd just like to take the floor to thank you all for joining us today, Michael, Dr. Su, and Lena. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we actually have a couple more questions that we ran out of time. We couldn't address them, but thanks again for being here. And I think it was a wonderful session. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.